Okay, all right, can you hear me? Okay, all right.
Dave, can you hear?
My wife and I last weekend went to see a new movie called Is This Thing On?, which is about a stand-up comedian, and so I'm feeling like I'm in that role. Mike Fellows really needs no introduction, so I'm not going to give him one. On the back of the handout that tells about the Gwyn and about Captain Fellows, there's a couple of paragraphs about Mike. He's been in Boulder for 30 years now. He retired after 26 years in the Army. He served one tour in Vietnam, one tour with the 25th Infantry Division in command of a engineering combat company, and had quite a number of adventures doing that as well. And he's been with the museum, I want to say since the start, but almost since the start. How many years now? 2008 he's been with us. And I mean, if anybody knows about the history of the museum and how we got started here, it would be Mike. He's a resource, and we're never going to let him retire. In fact, we're having a glass case built in which we're going to install him. So
Actually, he's the one we're not going to allow.
Well, I don't know about that, but it says here that your son, John, is a graphic designer, so maybe he can move to Broomfield and take my job when I'm too old to continue on. But at any rate, without further ado, Mike Fellows.
Thank you, Flint. Before we get going, I just want a couple special highlights too. Mike, can you talk a little about
Your microphone isn't turned on, I don't think. Right?
Is that on? Can you hear it?
Not really.
Oh. Testing. You hear now?
No.
You have a green light?
Yes,
Where's your microphone?
right up here.
You good?
Testing. Okay, well, good. But one of our special guests here, who's been a member of the board for ages and a big, marvelous contributor to the museum, is Bob Mulder. And Bob's right there.
What did I do?
No. But for those of you, you've probably heard many times me mentioning this, Bob has the most marvelous collection of Civil War artifacts at his house, the old basement level. And he knows the history behind all of it, marvelous collection of weapons as well.
Most of it true.
Yeah. You got to take a little bit there. But, you know, if you'd love to see it at all, he would love to have you come over. Normally we have a bunch of handouts which has his contact information, and we'll print it if you'd like one. And Bob, you want to add anything?
Well, the only thing I would add is that I'd love to have people come over if you're interested. It's always set up, so you don't have to plan a long time ahead. Just give me a call. And I'm home most of the time. And again, the museum, as Mike calls it, is open all the time, including this afternoon. So love to have company, love to have people come over, and at least in this area, I am told it's unique, and again, definitely hope to see you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Bob. And if at all interested, just contact me or any of those. We'll print out the little flyer which has all that information. I'd like to highlight John Carter, who's visiting us today. John, why don't you raise your hand? John's very much into wargaming, in particular naval stuff. And he showed me a collection he has that he brought here of miniature models of the ships that were involved in the first naval battle of the Solomon Islands, or Second Battle of Guadalcanal, and that's the one my father was involved in. But if you want to see, these are amazing little models. I mean, you have a battleship about that big, but with tremendous detail.
Metal or plastic?
No, they're metal, cast. And if you have any interest in wargaming type stuff, contact John, and he'll be here afterwards. John, you want to say anything?
Just, I remember Bob Moeller from years and years ago. I was giving a lecture in Boulder Public Schools. He was kind enough to loan me a firearm to show to the kids so they'd know what a musket with a bayonet on it felt like. So this man is definitely living history, if you want.
That's true. In fact, we have a picture of him on the monitor up there. So we know he's been around for a while. Well, anyway, just getting on with the story here. My father was a 1931 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, served 28 years in the Navy. And my story is kind of a story of discovery. What I finally learned about my father, what he did during the war and everything, sadly after he had long since passed. But there's another story too. Quite often, I'd get asked, how in heaven's name did you end up in the Army if your father was a career Navy officer? And all I can kind of say is that's another story. But I should have highlighted a couple special guests with us today. My son, Chris, who's our older one, right there. Chris, want to raise your hand? West Point class of '93 and stuff. And two great friends, Joe Henry and Chuck Jones, both classmates of mine, and currently are fishing, camping buddies, and just good friends for many years. And I think Gary Francis, I know he's here. Gary and I are classmates, but different schools. He graduated in '68 in Annapolis, and I did '68 at West Point. But again, I never regretted going to West Point. You notice how cool we looked in our cadet uniforms, all of us. And of course, that's where I met Becky, my wife of 57 years now. And again, our two sons who I'm so proud of, Chris and John, and their families. John lives in Crested Butte, and Chris and Leah live in Denver, so we get a chance to see them. But anyway, my father's family, again, I wish I'd known a lot of this much earlier. The first Fellows actually came to the U.S. here in New England in 1635. Two brothers from Herefordshire in England. About 100 years later, we ended up seeing that some Fellows started showing up in Nova Scotia. You kind of have a suspicion that these were kind of the loyalist crowd side of the family. In fact, the history of Gloucester, Massachusetts, which is a nice fishing port up there, in its history said there was a Samuel Fellows who had taken the job of excise tax collector for the crown. And this is about 1740, 50, and was duly visited by a bunch of patriots who convinced him to get out of town. And that's the end of the history that we know of that Samuel Fellows. But anyway, Dad's father had served as treasurer and mayor of the town of Fitchburg, Massachusetts. So most of our family's history is kind of up in New England and kind of that area. Dad had another brother, Carl, who was about 4 years younger than him. Carl also went to Annapolis. So I'm sure Dad's father was quite happy to have two sons, free education and all that stuff back at that time. Carl actually turned out to be quite the athlete and was quite a basketball star for Annapolis. This gentleman here, Dexter Fellows, is an interesting character. Great uncle, great uncle, I guess, to us. Dexter had a marvelous history, a life of being an advance man for Buffalo Bill's Wild West Circus. And when that kind of went away, moved over to the Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey Circus. He wrote a marvelous book, Make Way to the Big Top, which is his whole history. And there was a gentleman who could remember names for everything. But the interesting little side story to that is when I was still courting Becky, my wife, I met her grandfather and grandfather one time. They needed to introduce me around. And I introduced myself. And the first thing he said, "Are you related to Dexter Fellows?" That kind of blew me away. And I had to say, yes, the great uncle and all this stuff. Well, he said, well, when Dexter would come to his little town in Iowa where he grew up, he was part of this little school band. And he said Dexter would make it a point of hiring all the students who played in the school bands because he knew the parents would come and then the grandparents and everyone else. And so he actually met Dexter Fellows and fortunately had a good opinion of him. So once I passed that check mark and stuff, and certainly with her mother, I was in. And I was very fortunate for that. What did you do during the war? Well, you know, I grew up in a Navy family. I knew Dad was there. Every now and then I'd see him in uniform, you know, in 4th, 5th grade and stuff, but you don't pay much attention. In our house, in one of the little hallways, there was always this picture of the ship, a destroyer I eventually learned, and these two citations. And I'll have to admit, growing up, when you're younger, you just don't necessarily stand in front and read and say, what's this all about? So I did kind of know a lot of, you know, that he did do that sort of stuff. But we never really talked about it. You know, to those of us who are kind of elderly age, we grew up in a period when most of our family members, people we knew and stuff, were World War II veterans. Our teachers in our school quite often were Korean War veterans. And every now and then I would hear little things about it. And the thing which I do remember, which really struck me, is my dad's last assignment was in Italy. He headed the Mediterranean Surface Transportation Service. This was basically the logistics, Navy logistics support for the Med. We lived in Livorno, and probably the only high-rise in the town at that time. And every time a ship came in, we would tend to almost always have the captain and executive officer for dinner. And what I can just remember, I can't remember exact faces, but they were the classic naval officer to me, and particularly a summer. Normally wearing khakis, you know, the senior guys, kind of wrinkled, sunburned faces. And I would just kind of afterwards, they would sit around and talk. And I would just sit, at that time, I was like 8th grade. So I was beginning to think about this stuff. And I just listened to them talk and tell stories. And they weren't about war and all of that stuff. It was about funny things that happened. Or did you know so-and-so who's on this ship? Oh, yeah. And it just, to me, was, I wanted to join that crowd. Well, obviously I didn't. But I joined something equally, to me, as important. Let's see. Oh, yeah. Well, let me go. Well, when did I finally start learning about Dad? 4 years after I graduated, I'd gone through all the same things Chuck and Joe and so many of us did. You know, we had gone through company command, we had served in Vietnam. In my case, the Army said, well, we'll send you back to grad school. And I said, well, I'd like to go to MIT. So I applied, and they accepted me, probably because I was fully funded and stuff. But Dad was, at that time, working for an insurance company, and quite often would come to Boston. So we started meeting for lunch about every other week at the Officers Club of the Boston Navy Yard. And this time it was different. You're two officers talking to each other about stories. Granted, one was pretty young and stuff, But I had had command and gone through a lot of those challenges. And I started talking to Dad about his experiences. Oh, in fact, my lovely wife, Becky, has just arrived. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, we have a space up here if you'd like, Beck. But anyway, we just started telling stories. And I began to learn why he had a special feeling for the Boston Navy Yard. Well, the Gwin was built there. And that's kind of started his major career coming up here during World War II. Or, yeah, if you want to sit. Okay. But then it suddenly stopped. Sudden, unforeseen whatever, Dad died of a stroke. And I inherited his sea chest. Marvelous thing, well built, mitered corners, very nicely done. And I knew he'd said this had been constructed by a ship's carpenter for him at some point. But I never looked into it, never knew what was in it. So now I was kind of the proud owner of this thing. But to be truthful, I never really had the time to spend much time looking at it. You're still, in grad school, you're trying to survive and get through that. Then your next couple assignments, and it came along with us, except when we were in Germany and had to be in storage and all that. And followed us out here to Colorado, and essentially became a nice little coffee table for me. And then when I started volunteering here, one of the original founders of the our little museum here, Bob Sieber, World War II veteran, served on a destroyer escort off of Okinawa. And we started talking, and I told him about my father, and he kind of put me to shame. He said, you really need to do something to learn about your father's service. So at that point, I figured, okay, better look into this thing. So what did I find? Again, when you open the chest, you see that it's nicely lined with heavy canvas. Every ship had that heavy type of canvas material. And what it was just filled with citations, all sorts of stuff. I found a little box which had his medals. And, nowadays you look at, any of the military officers, Navy and that, they got a whole chest full of these medals. That's the sum total for most everyone, who served during World War II. The Navy Cross, Silver Star, that was the UN, and that probably was the Pacific something. I need to look at that. And this is a nice little case. It's upstairs in the exhibit in the Pacific War Room that Flint had put together. I found an oil portrait of Dad rolled up in there, and he's the captain there. So I think that was done when we were in Italy. I found the citations for his Navy Cross and Silver Star citations. And then I found some stuff I couldn't quite recognize at first. There were a series of photographs stamped confidential, nothing on them, which explained what they were. Most of us could probably recognize the one with the aircraft carrier. It's the Yorktown. But why would we have a picture one which shows a whaleboat there, obviously heading over there? And what the heck is this? Alaska. These are destroyers and other ships in there. It's obviously a fjord, way kind of north. But then you got kind of an indication what it might be connected with that. There's a marvelous, and you should come up and see that, a marvelous citation, whatever, which chronicles that, well, wasn't even commander, Lieutenant John B. Fellows crossed the Arctic Circle in October of 1941. So, okay, he obviously was up there. This is a funny tongue-in-cheek thing written up when he was served much later after the war with the UN Commission. He was a Naval Secretariat to the UN Commission with all the negotiations with the North Koreans. But it's a tongue-in-cheek of his experiences there. Yeah.
Is there any
Bob.
special celebration, like when you cross the equator?
Yes, and I
Do
have
something
another
for the
one.
Arctic Circle too?
Yeah, oh, yes, both of them. And what happens is you really get, well, I'm sure, who else? Well, I mean, we have Navy people galore in here. Pete, what happens when you cross?
The Arctic Circle, you get the Order of the Blue Nose.
And,
The blue nose?
They put Prussian bluing on your nose and it doesn't come off the blunt.
and how about the equator? Anyone here? Well, Rich.
Yeah, that was pretty cool.
Well,
We went through the initiation, and luckily for me, I had an early watch, so I was able to get a shower.
yeah. Well, you do get harassed horrendously. Yeah,
You
Pete.
don't want to go across the equator when you're a lieutenant.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, because all the troops get a chance to hammer you.
Well, I found a complete set of the detailed prints for the Gwyn. And they're kind of here, they're kind of falling apart. But I hadn't quite expected to see that. And it shows all the interior layout and everything you'd ever need to know, probably to build it almost.
Shellback. That's
Shellback, okay. Okay.
Was the Gwyn a Fletcher class?
No, it was a Gleaves class, and a Gleaves class, about 2 classes before the famous Fletcher. And then, okay, now I started learning a little bit more related to the 2 citations, as there were some old, newspaper articles, and even one about a reunion about the Gwyn. And many ships have a kind of a little reunion group together. And I went online and actually found that group existed, but since it's kind of dissipated. No one's left, and the next generation just doesn't really connect with all of this. And then I found some classified after-action reports. You know, should you really be carting those around? Now there's not a problem, but there were 3 of them. Landings on Rendova Island, landings at Rice Anchorage in Kula Gulf, and night action off of Kula Gulf, which resulted in the loss of the Gwyn. And then at that point, I wrote off, that's all I kind of had. So Bob told me to write off to the Naval something or another and get a copy of his transcript of service. And I did. And that really explained quite a lot. I just listed here his stuff up until the service with the Gwyn. Obviously, it went on, much beyond that. But you could see for anyone who's in the Navy, or even us in the Army, you get a series of assignments which built your experience at higher levels, of responsibility and stuff. And you could kind of see, starting with a junior officer, engineering watch officer, then communications, navigator, commo executive officer, and so on down the line, until the Gwyn, engineering officer, executive officer, and then commanding officer. The one, yes.
What was the silver, what was the Navy Cross for?
Well, we'll get to that. That's kind of part of the discovery of all of this. One thing, it struck me, some of these I could even recognize as you started looking at the history of particularly the Pacific. I mean, Chicago, Talbot, Warden show up in future stories of the Pacific. But the Crown and Shield was kind of different. But then I discovered, as I did some more reading about the history, we all remember the Lend-Lease Act, which Roosevelt put together. And as part of that, we sold the British, we kind of traded. I think it was, 90, well, I forget how many, but it was 50 old destroyers in exchange for, leases of critical bases and stuff. Well, the Crowning Shield was one of them. So lo and behold, starting off, Dad was involved in that, historic kind of trade. And I think that was done out of Boston, but in any event. So this was quite eye-opening to me. Well, then I think it would have been much more difficult early on if I wanted to learn anything about naval history and ships. The best, ever reference was Samuel Eliot Morison, The History of the United States Naval Operations During World War II. If you ever want to do that, this is a marvelous start. It's not just one book, it's about a dozen, which covers everything from the beginning. And the two that I found most interesting was Guadalcanal and Breaking Open the Bismarcks, because that kind of is the Pacific part. But it also had a section which explained what went on before the war. Well, what was the Gwin? It was a Gleaves-class destroyer, built and launched at the Boston Navy Yard in June of 1940. A lieutenant command, destroyers are named after military heroes. Cruisers, cities, battleships, states, and all that stuff. But we got plenty of heroes. Lieutenant Commander Gwin was a young naval officer, commanded these little river ironclads, which helped move troops around, but provided artillery support to General Grant and Union forces actually out in the West. And he was cited multiple times for his support to Grant in the capture of Fort Donelson, Shiloh, and Vicksburg. And fortunately was later killed in one of the operations. So anyway, it was launched or christened by Mrs. Lippincott, who was a great-great-grandnephew of Lieutenant Commander Gwin. So Gwin was a Gleaves-class destroyer. That was about 2 classes before the famous Fletcher destroyers. It still was a pretty good size one, about almost 350 feet in length. Displacement was about 1,600 tons, 1,630, which was bigger than the earlier ones. But the Fletchers were about 2,300 tons, about 30 feet longer, so ended up being much more capable. You could crowd on a lot more anti-aircraft stuff on it. When you looked at what it was launched with for anti-aircraft defense, you had 4 of your 5-inch 38 caliber guns. These are the great guns for destroyers and stuff, which had both anti-aircraft and surface capability engagements. But then the only other thing they had were 6 50 caliber machine guns. I mean, for us in the Army, we know what they are. They're useless for this. But that's what the, Gwin was commissioned with.
Did they ever refit her with any of those?
Yes, and that came a little later. However, they also had depth charges, 2 racks of them on the back. And they actually, looking at the history, they did use them periodically, trying to chase submarines out, Japanese subs. But here's the one worth discussing. This was supposedly to really give the real sting to our destroyers. That's the Mark 15 torpedo. The Buell Ordnance, this was their baby. They loved it. But you look at it. Mark 15 had a range, at a max range of about 8,200 yards. That's right about the distance that we could normally engage ships with our 5-inch guns. So you almost have to get as close to them as so you could shoot them up as you could hopefully kind of hit them with a torpedo. The size of the warhead was 400 pounds. The Japanese Type 93 torpedo, which for some reason or other we never seemed to realize they had a warhead of 1,000 pounds. It had a range of 44,000 yards. I mean, you could stand off miles and miles, fire this thing, and just go away. And we'll see, this became the major weapon that the Japanese used so effectively against us. In fact, this picture on the left depicts just one of the issues related to that torpedo. Can anyone kind of recognize?
Ran too deep. Too deep. Ran under the ship.
Okay, this was a target ship. No excuse to miss it. You see this nice big line bubbling through the thing, and it kept going. It ran too deep. No matter, you set it for 10 feet, may run 30 feet. Bureau Ordnance now said, no, it's your problem. What else do you see on it? It also has an interest.
Well, it's got the bubbles.
It's got the bubbles.
You can see it coming.
Our torpedoes were powered by compressed air, which then burnt a fuel, alcohol I think it was, expanded, ran through a turbine, which propelled the torpedo. The combustion products of that is carbon dioxide and water. Well, guess what? That creates bubbles. It doesn't get readily absorbed out the end of the torpedo. So what you're seeing is a nice stretch there, a nice little line, effectively saying something's coming at you.
And they can trace it back to you.
Yes. Now, did the Japanese have that problem? No. Their torpedoes did not use compressed air. They used pure oxygen, but in compressed tanks. When that burned with the fuel, basically the only exhaust you got out of it was water and some unburned oxygen and stuff. And that was readily absorbed in the water. So not only the Type 99 torpedo had a much longer distance that it could go, it also left no tracks. And for the longest time, we never recognized that this sort of torpedo existed.
Sir,
Yeah.
compressed air. Mm-hmm. This is mostly nitrogen. No
Yes,
wonder there were bubbles.
yes, absolutely. But we also had another slight problem with this. This would be a typical cruiser-destroyer operation lineup. If you got cruisers mixed in with destroyers, invariably they'll put a line of destroyers out front, cruisers in the middle, and maybe some destroyers in the back. I guess they were worried about someone's going to sneak up with you. Well, all the action's up here. So these guys typically are headed by a rear admiral who remembers everything he did during the pre-war naval exercises, which always emphasize you cross the T to your enemy. And that way, if you cross in front of the enemy, you can bring all your guns to bear. But that also means you get within about 10,000 yards of the enemy. And invariably what would happen if, and what we found out in the Solomons and elsewhere, if the enemy's coming down at that, showing the red arrow, we detected them because now we had radar. We'd pass the command to start turning, to cross the T. And by about the time, even before we have finally crossed the T, they've seen us. The destroyers up in front of there all leash a massive, whole spread of Type 93 torpedoes.
Yeah,
They're coming toward you. You have no idea it's coming. And just about the time you make your turn, lo and behold, you're within this spread. And if you fire 30, 40 of them, some are going to hit. And that creates havoc because all this is ongoing at night, not in the nice daytime. And then not only that, once the destroyers have shot off all their torpedoes, they simply peeled off, went to the back, and reloaded. Our destroyers never learned or had the capability to reload at sea. You had to go back into port. So once they reloaded, they just came back again. And we never seemed to catch on to that. And just to show the type of example, one of the major last battles here at Tassafarango, every one of the cruisers suffered severe damage from torpedoes. And that can, in Type 93 could totally take out your bow. One torpedo hit on the destroyer and it's basically all over. But we did have, some sort of step up very much on the Japanese. The Japanese were way ahead of us in skills of night fighting. Their optics were superb for binoculars. And I read something which said they specifically selected sailors who are going to be lookouts based on their eyesight. And, some people have much better eyesight at night and sensitivity than others. So early on, they very much, had a much better strategy and experience fighting at night. But by 1942, radar started being perfected and we're beginning to put on ships. The first kind of crude one was radar type SC, which was more of an aircraft type of identification. You needed to have special training to know how to interpret the little dashes and stuff you were getting. But later on, the radar type SG of a surface type radar and its subsequent ones actually gave you the ability to see an image on a screen, which showed actually disposition of troops and all that stuff. And then we learned to connect it to a special type of a fire direction control system. So now you had the capability of taking the plots, the angles, the bearings from here and distances, plotted into kind of a computer type system, and then use it to direct your guns. And very much was important and utilized with cruisers, and it came online very much with the Fletcher class. And again, at night fighting, the first shots count. Remember, you're totally dark. The enemy's out there, and you can see you're getting closer. Someone's got to make a decision which way you're going to turn. And again, the first shots count, because as soon as you fire, you've given up your position. And if all the ships fire at the same time, they see exactly where everyone is. And if they haven't fired all their torpedoes off, you know what's coming next. And this is, a picture. I think this was taken later on in Battle of Kula Gulf, showing, what you would see if you were looking out as other ships are firing. Now, again, the fire direction things are really nifty, helps you get off the first shots. But after that, what you ended up finding out later on is when you start firing a lot of rounds, they're not all going to hit the ship. And when they hit the water, they cause water spouts. And the bigger the type of shell, the bigger the type of water spouts. Well, those get picked up by the radar too. And lo and behold, after about the first couple salvos, if you keep firing, who knows where the shots are going? And in fact, what was done when analysis after the Battle of Kalimantan, and I know they did it to others, they sunk basically one Japanese cruiser. Between 3 cruisers, they fired over 2,000 rounds at this one ship. And they think that maybe 20 actually hit it. So what partly happens here? You got a line of ships coming in. They're looking at their radar. You got big blips and you got little blips. Well, what do you think? They all started firing at the big blip. Every cruiser and that. And so, in fact, and later we'll talk in that battle, everyone else scooted free. One big cruiser got sacrificed. Most everyone else, no one paid any attention to. And similarly, what happens early in the war is that's probably the first time, particularly for the bigger ships, battleships and cruisers, first time you probably fired all your guns at the same time. Well, guess what reverberates through a big ship when you fire everything at once? You know, cables come unsnapped. Radios that was on some ship and knocked down, you know, come out. Things stop working. And so there was kind of some tense times on some ships. But, you know, we pretty much learned from that. And, you know, you tend to think the ship totally blows up, which kills you. Well, you know, when a shell, particularly, you know, high explosive, hits steel on one side, even if it doesn't go through, the backside just becomes a mass of shrapnel. And anywhere a heavy round hits, each one of these reflects a shrapnel hole that occurred inside, it probably was one of the cruisers or something after a war. If you were anywhere in those rooms, you were dead meat. And that's why the you know, casualty rate often was so high. So anyway, that's enough kind of what I learned on the side. Getting back to kind of the story, what did I know about the Gwin, and how did I find, you know, how did I interpret some of the stuff I found? Well, getting back to that photo, I started again through Admiral Morrison's history here. You know, highlighted that in August 41, we started sending Lend-Lease convoys to Russia at this time. And we'd been doing it to certainly Britain for ages. And Admiral Stark, even though we were not, you know, Congress said, don't you dare do anything to get involved in the war. He went ahead and we had an agreement with the British that we would send destroyers and stuff out to cruise around the Denmark Strait. That's the area kind of between Iceland and Greenland up there, and even other areas. Because the British were concerned that the German pocket battleships and others would sneak through that and come back and around behind them to attack convoys. And lo and behold, I did find a reference and pictures of saying our ships were based out of the Halva or whatever fjord, which is on the north side of Iceland. And I found some pictures which pretty well matched this. Not the exact thing with these ships, but that kind of explained that particular picture and why Dad had received that recognition of crossing the Arctic Circle. Well, December 1941, Dad's ship, and I'm sure others, said, get the heck out to the Pacific. So that was quite the trek, going from Iceland down the US coast, through the Panama Canal, back on up. And he says, I could find something which said at some point they stopped in the Panama Canal, San Diego for stores, and then got up to San Francisco. And lo and behold, just in time to join Task Force 18, which became the screening force for the Doolittle raid. The Enterprise provided air cover support for the Hornet, you know, and Dad's destroyer was part of that crowd, just one of many. But there's been a classic photo, and we have that upstairs too, showing the B-25s on the Hornet all lined up, and the destroyer coming on side. And the description says that's the Gwin. So somewhere on there is my father. At that time was the executive officer. And that's the USS Chicago in the background. So anyway, you know, they did all of that. And then lo and behold, you know, kind of came back from that. And Task Force 16, another one with, I guess the Enterprise again, was heading out to the Coral Sea. But that battle was over by then. So they came back. I mean, it was a busy time for the Gwin. 23rd of May, the Gwin brought loaded up a bunch of Marine Commando unit, raced it out to Midway. And that's, I'm trying to remember the mileage to get out there. Yeah, I think it was like 2,300, but so you come back from that. You have the Battle of Midway 3 through 6 June. The Gwyn's then sent back out there to assist with the recovery of the Yorktown. And looking at kind of the some notes about the Gwyn's history, it mentions that once they got there, they sent a salvage party over to help with the Yorktown. That's before they kind of decided you weren't going to be able to save it. So that's a whaleboat coming from a ship, which probably had to be the Gwyn, heading over toward the Yorktown. And then, you know, a seagoing tug was sent out there to start towing it back. And sadly, we know what happened, you know, when the USS Hammond, the destroyer, came on side to help remove the rest of the people. And I think it was also to provide some emergency power for pumps or stuff on it. And both of them got sunk by a Japanese sub, which was able to stand way off a distance, nowhere close, shooting at a big fat target which was barely moving. How could you miss? And so the Gwyn picked up, I think, about 200 of the survivors from various things, along with other ships, to come back to Pearl Harbor with it. Yeah, if we're going through, if you got a question, go ahead and ask. There's a lot I'm trying to cover. Well, the next thing up was the Solomon Islands campaign. And why the Solomon Islands were kind of important? Because it was absolutely critical for us to ensure that Australia could stay in the war. Remember, we had split responsibility up in the Pacific between the Central Drive through here, which was under Admiral Nimitz, and then the Southern Drive up through New Guinea and stuff to the Philippines under General MacArthur, for which Admiral Halsey was the naval lead for all of that. So the big concern was that if the Japanese retained control of the Solomon Islands, it directly impacted our ability to support the Australians. So anyway, a couple items that'll show up just to point out here because they come up later. Guadalcanal. Well, actually, even before that. This you could kind of almost interpret as a big contest between two different forces. Our forces were kind of based out of Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides. That was the major logistics place. If you're coming out from Hawaii and all that, you don't go straight to this area. You go down here. And this is the area where we stage everything and then bring it up to Guadalcanal, and that's about 600 miles. For the Japanese, Guadalcanal, the main base was Rabaul. Not a atoll, it was a big volcano which had this marvelous big bay area that could host the whole Japanese fleet. And they reinforced that, and that became their main strain point for everything they're doing in this area. And that was about 800 miles up there. And so the battleground is all down in this area. And this is what's called the slot. And I'll mention a little bit more of that. And again, all of this came as I start reading, and again, this was kind of marvelous. The references, there's so many books. There's an excellent one, Neptune's Inferno. Bob reminded me of that. And that is focused totally on the naval battles from the Guadalcanal. And it was superb. In Guadalcanal itself, many of us are familiar with, obviously, Henderson Field, Lunga Point, where there was a lot of fighting along. Florida Island, we don't really mention too much, but Tulagi, which was initially a float plane base for the Japanese, became probably our major staging point within the Solomons for the Navy. Let's see. Cape Esperance, Wasavo Island, which I'll mention, Cape Esperance and Tassafarango. Esperance and Tassafarango were locations the Japanese tried to bring in troops and do their logistics, landings and everything there. The naval losses at Guadalcanal, I never really realized it as much until more recently. The Navy lost more personnel during the battles for the Solomon Islands during August to the February period than the Army did. And yes, you can kind of see, if you lose a ship big time out there, you basically lose at least 90% of the people all at one fell swoop. You know, we lost 2 aircraft carriers, you know, Hornet and Wasp, not directly in that area, but in adjacent battles which went on. Japanese lost more of a light aircraft carrier, but they lost 2 battleships. We didn't lose any, but boy, we lost a bunch of cruisers with that. So what was the GWIN's involvement here? Again, looking back at history, I could kind of track generally what went on. The GWIN was part of the initial forces that moved into the Solomon Islands. It was part of the covering force built around the USS Enterprise, which provided the naval aircraft support for all of that. So again, you know, in August, you know, we first landed our forces at both Guadalcanal and Tulagi. And then essentially from August through October, you know, GWIN was just one of multiple destroyers, you know, whose sole purpose was providing support and cover, you know, for the logistic ships moving back and forth, for tankers coming in, helping to move the Marines around when they needed to go from one location to another, and providing close-in artillery support when needed. And again, to highlight, destroyers did the exact same thing for us during the Vietnam War. In fact, I think, Dan, do you serve on a destroyer? Anyone else? Okay, yes, Lou. The 5-inch gun is equally as effective as any of the Army's artillery pieces when you need it, and you can't really land a bunch of stuff with you. So anyway, you know, nothing too exciting. They fought off a bunch of air attacks, dumped a bunch of ash cans, you know, for some potential submarine attacks and stuff. But it was just a constant shuttling back and forth with things. Well, at this point, I just figured I needed to at least highlight. The thing I always found difficult as I was trying to analyze, learn what's going on, is there were a whole series of naval battles in there. And in contrast to the Army, which your battle tended to be in one place and you fought over it until, you know, one side gave up or something, these were all different. And what we did see, you know, 7 August, we started the invasion of Guadalcanal, and right off the beginning, Japanese were not going to allow us to get away with it. And their, you know, big thrust was to recapture Henderson Field, drive us out of the Solomon Islands. And they started right off with a very heavy, you know, cruiser task force, which came sailing down through the slot area, totally captured the forces we had. We had 4 heavy cruisers, a bunch of destroyers, and totally caught us flat-footed. We didn't know they were coming. We were not at an alert, you know, there. The senior commanders thought the Japanese was still quite a ways up the slot. Well, they were amongst us before we knew what happened. 4 heavy cruisers were sunk, not just damaged, sunk. Destroyers were basically really damaged. The few that we had available, they've kind of got shot up pretty bad. But
Is that a night action?
all of these are night actions. And boy, and because of that, we had lost all major naval support for the Marines on shore. You know, we've always heard this thing about the Marines felt they were abandoned. Well, after that, they kind of were. We didn't have anything readily available. The naval forces were totally in shock of what's going on. And it took a while to get reorganized.
I'm sorry, Mike, was this the Battle of Eastern Solomons? Or
No, I'm talking Savo Island. Now, Eastern Solomons and also the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands were actually aircraft carrier battles. They weren't right in the slot kind of area. One was kind of off to the north, one was more to kind of the east. Those involved, I think, the Enterprise. The Wasp missed the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands. Hornet, that is another one. Yeah, well, and the Saratoga early on, I think, was torpedoed and kind of had to go back. But anyway, these two were actually aircraft carrier battles. They were kind of, it was kind of a, I would say, standoff. You can't claim one side or the other really, significantly beat the other. The Japanese were really hoping to wipe out whatever carriers we had. The Enterprise took a lot of hits, suffered. We lost the Wasp. But the Japanese lost a lot of experienced aircraft crews that they couldn't really afford. We could replace them. Now, Battle of Cape Esperance was the first positive battle we had where it looked like we kind of won. Again, cruisers, destroyers. We caught the Japanese kind of by surprise, which was surprising in itself, and basically prevented them from being able to unload all the troops and stuff that they wanted to do. The Japanese learned at that point you cannot plan to bring your troops down on nice, slow-moving cargo ships. They just don't cut it. From that point on, they had to bring all the supplies in on fast-moving destroyers. Get them in there, dump the stuff, and get out. What happened here is they had to abandon the cargo ships, told them to just basically run aground and try to offload it from there. And they were not very successful. Where the Gwin now kind of gets involved really here was the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. But to do that, you have to talk about the first battle. And normally when you talk about the Naval Battle of Solomon Islands, it's this continual action. But let me at least point out something again related to the Tokyo Express. We controlled during daylight everything within about a 200-mile radius of Guadalcanal. That's about the distance our fighters from Henderson Field could get out and attack. And you could do that during the day. Beyond that, up through the slot, the Japanese pretty much had free rein. So the challenge for them was, you want to bring in a bunch of supplies, troops to Guadalcanal. Well, you have to set your timing to leave Rabaul such that you are going to be out in this area just beyond our 200-mile plus range by the darkness. Normally they say like 10 o'clock. Things are kind of very dark down through there. And then from that point, it's a race to get down here, unload your stuff, and get out of the range before daylight. Because immediately at that point, the Henderson Field, our Cactus, Air Force is going to be out there, and it's really going to extract this severe, a severe toll. That was it. And this shows after the Cape Esperance, at the tail end, the Japanese basically told their, a couple cargo ships and stuff there, just run aground and try and offload. How do you think easy you think it's to offload on a ship? When you just have soldiers and stuff on the ground. So that pretty much, from that point on, they knew they couldn't do that.
One of the
yeah.
things that you might mention that made a big difference is this is all after Midway. And the Japanese lost 4 of their main big carriers. So we had an airfield. We had a ground-based aircraft carrier.
Well, and you might say, well, shoot, if they got to come all the way down the slot, why didn't, and we have aircraft carriers, why didn't we just position some out there and tack them? Well, most of ours were back getting repaired.
Yeah, you can't sink the ones at
Yeah.
Henderson Field.
Yeah, so that was why it was so critical for us, the Marines and everyone, to keep the Henderson Field. And it was so important for the Japanese to prevent us from that. So anyway, kind of during this whole period, the Gwin is, again, as far as I can tell, is shuttling back and forth, doing all the support things, that other destroyers were doing. Well, we need to briefly talk about these 2 battles. The first one was the first naval battle of Guadalcanal, oftentimes called a cruiser engagement, night action. What was happening is the Japanese were getting very serious that they needed to take out Henderson Field. And if you're going to do that, you're going to probably need a battleship, a bunch of heavy cruisers, and while we're at it, we need to bring in a bunch of troops. So they were coming down from the slot around, Savo Island, and this was the area where the basic battle of Savo Island was. So they were coming down, pretty substantial force, 2 battleships, light cruisers, a whole bunch of transport groups. That's what, the key things was blow out Henderson Field and get these troops landed with cargo. Well, the thing faced with us, quite often these groups had worked together in the past. They had a definite plan of action. They were very used to night fighting, night engagements. Every time we put together a group to kind of counter them, it was just pulling together whatever was available. And it constantly changed. So our order of battle, that should look familiar, had 3 destroyers up front. Then you had 5 cruisers. This was pulled together. Atlanta actually was an aircraft cruiser. This was just a cruiser with just gobs of 5-inch guns on deck. Nothing bigger, but lots of them. The light cruise, and then 2 heavy cruisers, and Helena, which was a light cruiser. So these typically would have 6-inch guns. Heavy cruisers like 8-inch, maybe even a few larger. So who was the head of this? There were 2 rear admirals in this group. There's Admiral Daniel Callahan, who had been the lead previously out there and had experience with the night fighting. But the senior admiral on there, Admiral Raymond Scott was the more experienced one. But Admiral Callahan was more senior by a couple days, I think they said. So obviously he was in charge, had never been involved in any sort of battles. This was his ship. The San Francisco did not have radar on it, but he wanted that. Portland and Helena did have radar. And I think Cushing, at least one of the destroyers did. So here you're going into a major battle. Your key lead here doesn't have the availability of radar to see exactly what's going on. So he's having to make inquiries with other ships in terms of the disposition. Basically, you kind of came up. They ended up seeing these coming down. went to cross the T finally, and then, as it was kind of just explained, without getting into a lot of detail, it was like a bar brawl, in a dark room, totally black. And essentially what happened is they got up close. They didn't fire any of our torpedoes and stuff. Wouldn't probably worked anyway. But when the U.S. forces fired first, when you did that, you showed exactly where everybody was. And the Japanese unloaded with all of that. Now, fortunately, things didn't quite work out all for them as well. The brawl just really became continual. We lost a lot, but ultimately they lost one battleship, 2 destroyers. That was the way. And they had to split off the cargo ships and just tell them beach themselves. Losses were pretty big for us. Cushing and Laffey were sunk. Atlanta was sunk. Juneau was severely damaged and later was sunk by a Japanese torpedo on its way to Espiritu Santo. And there was a lot of controversy. You may have heard about the Sullivan brothers. We have a destroyer upstairs that was named after them. The Navy policy generally was you don't put, relatives on the same ship. Well, there were 5 brothers who somehow got enough permission to put all together on the Juneau, and all 5 were lost. So anyway, it was a pretty severe loss of power, but it prevented the Japanese from accomplishing their main mission, which was to pound out Henderson Field. But that didn't end it. Going back, Yamamoto. Well, this was supposedly a photo, obviously color enhanced, of what it looked like during the first naval battle, as taking a picture from the shore where the Marines were. And you can imagine, totally dark, quiet, and all of a sudden, boom, 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 everything, showing up. And again, when you fire these big guns, even if they're flashless or smokeless powder, you can get different types, you still create quite a lot of smoke from that. So that scatters the light too. So I can just imagine what that must have looked like and sounded like.
And the Marines at night couldn't tell who was winning.
Right. Well, okay. What happened is the Japanese forces moved back and regrouped. Yamamoto said, wait a minute, you haven't completed the destruction of Henderson Field. So they quickly pulled together some additional forces and said, go back there and accomplish it. So there's barely a pause. By the time you finish here, you have the next group getting organized coming down. Well, we're kind of faced with a tough situation. You basically had gone through all the cruisers that you had immediately available. The only things were available were some destroyers and 2 battleships. And they were part of the kind of covering force for the Enterprise and the aircraft carriers we kind of out here. But we were fortunate. The senior person who was put in charge was Admiral Lee. Let's see, what's his first name? Willis, yes. Willis Ching Lee. He was a strong believer in the use of radar control for, engagements. And he trained his crew mercifully, supposedly, with that. So they were pretty capable. South Dakota was, again, a very capable battleship. And so the lineup was quickly pulling together whatever destroyers they could get their hands on. And again, the problem is you just can't have a destroyer out there. It's got to have a good amount of ammunition and a good amount of fuel still. So these were Walkie, Benham, Preston, and Gwynn were the ones that were readily available. So they were kind of pulled into this thing too. So what's kind of happening here? The Japanese, again, coming down from this way, up from the slot, they split their forces and sent a couple cruisers, destroyers around Savo Island this side. They came around the rest of that side. South Dakota, Washington, Gwin, Preston, the rest of them were coming down. The radar gave them a pretty good indication what's going on. You couldn't see what's going on behind Savo Island. The problem with radar, if a ship is kind of right in front of a major island, you know, that's kind of high, it's hard to pick it out because the mass of the island kind of blinds things. But they kind of saw what was coming. Kind of, you know, once they saw that, you knew you're heading in the wrong direction. So you kind of turn around, and starting at about this point, the battleships started firing. Way too far away from most of the destroyers at that time, but destroyers were out ahead. And essentially what happened is destroyers became the sacrificial group in there. The cruisers came down, focused kind of on them. And then something strange happened. You should have two battleships here. Well, the South Dakota suddenly went dark. The South Dakota was having electrical problems. And their chief, whoever was down in the engineering area, thought it'd be a good idea to tie down the electrical switch area. What?
Circuit breakers.
Yeah, circuit breakers for the ship. So they tied them down. That way they won't trip. Well, what happened is, as soon as they started firing and everything, you know, that suddenly is a surge of power. You need to do all of that. Well, it blew everything out. The total ship went dark. You couldn't see from radar. You couldn't control your guns. You had trouble just controlling it. So here's the Washington chugging along, thinking the South Dakota is right there. And suddenly it just disappears almost. You could see it, but you're trying to figure out what's going on. Well, what kind of helped out the Washington, as kind of things went along, and we'll show you something a little bit here. What happened is the Japanese focused on the South Dakota. They saw that. Well, while they're focused on the South Dakota, the Washington just kind of quietly went along. Okay, this is the South Dakota. Washington just kind of went along off to the side, stayed quiet until he could see the Japanese ships readily in view, and then opened up. What the South Dakota did show is that you could take a lot of punishment and still survive. I mean, they were hit multiple times and basically survived. Not so well with our ultra destroyers, Walkie, Benham, and Preston. And amazed at what's out there on YouTube. I just went, just for the heck of it, I plugged in USS Gwin. And lo and behold, there were about a half dozen different videos, highlighting the Gwin. And this was one of them.
On November 14, 1942, USS Gwin joined battleships South Dakota and Washington and three other destroyers to intercept the Japanese force near Savo Island, leading to the intense naval battle of Guadalcanal. During the chaotic night battle, Gwin engaged in a fierce duel against the Japanese light cruiser Nagara and two destroyers, Ayanami and Uranami. Despite taking hits to her engine room and fantail and facing torpedo attacks, Gwin continued firing. Though her depth charges detonated from the damage, she remained in the fight. With the other three American destroyers disabled, two sinking and the Benham severely damaged, Gwin bravely attempted to escort the crippled Benham to Espiritu Santo. When it became clear the Benham could not be saved, Gwin rescued her crew and scuttled the abandoned hull with gunfire. After landing the survivors, Gwin sailed for repairs at Mare Island Navy Yard, arriving in December 1942. Did you know?
I mean, who would have ever guessed? I mean, it was just one of hundreds of destroyers out there. And there are many others like that.
At this time, the Japanese did not have radar, is that correct?
Correct. But they did have a system that could detect our radar pulses and actually had ability to actually use those pulses to plot out where our ships were. You didn't get a nice image, but they weren't totally oblivious to, but at this point, they didn't have it on a lot of their ships.
I wondered how they were so good at night fighting
Yeah.
without radar.
Well, you'd practice. You practice, and they had a very simple approach to it. You put your destroyers out front, you flood the area with torpedoes, peel off, boom, boom. Once you've created the havoc and you can see what's there, the big ships can come in. Yeah, John.
If you look at the bridge of a Japanese destroyer, it's kind of like an ellipse with, and every window has a set of binoculars behind it. So they've got 312, about 270-degree knowledge. And they, as you said, great eyesight guys, light gathering binoculars. And the early radar, our early radar, oftentimes got blinded by land shadow. So oftentimes their binoculars are spotting us even before our radar spots them. And here's the funny thing, we were calling them nearsighted little yellow monkeys.
Yes.
Oops.
Yeah. Well, at the end of this, obviously, Gwyn was pretty shot up. And so, you know, it's a long trek to come back to the U.S., but you essentially had to. So, you know, you got back to Espiritu Santo, and from there to Hawaii, and then eventually from there back to Mare Island. And, you know, it's, what, 2,000 miles to Hawaii. It was like 2,300 miles to Espiritu Santo, another 600 miles to Guadalcanal. So quite a trek. Did point it out that after, well, in fact, two things. The Gwyn tried to sink the Benham with torpedoes first. Well, what do you think? They sent 4 of them. You couldn't miss. It's sitting there deep in the water. All went underneath. So that's why they finally sunk them with gunfire. You know, so the torpedo problem hadn't been solved, obviously, by this point in '42.
Where's Mare Island? Is that near San Diego?
No, that's in San Francisco Bay.
San Francisco Bay.
Yeah. But again, now, you know, as part of the upgrade, one, they got a big change in paint and all that stuff too. But they got upgraded sonar. Now they had a radar, SC and the SG. They didn't before. And the Mark 37 fire direction control. And that's what you're kind of seeing here. That's kind of the SG. I don't see an S. I saw an earlier one, which is the SC, which just looks like a big square, like a mattress, bed spring type things. So anyway, and now, lo and behold, they're going to really be powerful now with a bunch of 20 millimeter, you know, anti-aircraft guns. Not big enough. The problem is these ships are not quite big enough to have one or more of the 40 millimeter, the Bofors, classic pom-pom type things. The Fletchers were. That's partly why. Yes, Philip.
One thing I wanted to mention, I read that book, Neptune's Inferno, and also about the USS Washington Battleship at War.
Yeah.
And it was involved in one of the last actual battleship-to-battleship confrontations. And I believe it was a Japanese battleship, Hiroshima. It sunk it, and his gunnery was so good that he actually was able to hit the Japanese battleship just below the waterline that acted like torpedoes. And the only damage to the Washington in that confrontation was a little bit of the rigging for the radar up top.
Yeah. And again, the key is
Amazingly accurate ship.
get off your first shots and make them count. So anyway, the Gwyn is finally back into Espiritu Santo in May of '43. So the next grouping up, yeah,
Question?
yes, Lou.
The Navy then had the 3-inch 50 guns that were much better anti-aircraft, but they didn't put them on the Gwyn?
Well, as far as I could tell from, you know, whatever records I could get hold of, yeah, John.
They start replacing the 40 millimeter right after the war, because the 40 was not a stopper against the kamikaze. So
Okay.
it's not till after the war that you see twin 3-inchers
Yeah.
replacing quad 40s.
Okay. By this time, with the Gwin back, the Battle of Guadalcanal is over. The Japanese have effectively been able to withdraw all their troops. But the ultimate goal was to get up and make Rabaul, untenable to the Japanese. So you're faced now with kind of moving up the slot. You didn't have to invade every cotton picking island here, but you had to at least seize any island that has significant air base on it, because the air bases allowed them to, attack anything we had going. So Guadalcanal here, the Russell Islands fell pretty quick afterwards. The next big grouping was New Georgia, and that turned out to be quite a hard nut to crack. Oh yeah, well, okay, we can refer to here.
Did the Japanese have an air base on
Yes.
Georgia?
Yeah, in fact, the major base they had was on Munga Point here. They had another one on Villa, on Kalamangara, were the two kind of main ones. But the fighting in this area, they say, was actually for both the Marines and the Army units even worse than it was in Guadalcanal. Why? Because the Japanese had been there for a good while. The terrain was much more swampy in many areas. And the Japanese had embedded reinforced pillboxes everywhere with whatever avenues you could have for advancing. So the Gwin and others supported the Army and the Marines as you first made your landings here. Rendova Island had to be captured because they had a bunch of Japanese forces there and artillery, which would attack whatever you had. So the landings were kind of on this side here, and you had to kind of move in this direction, and it was just brutal. Not only that, the Japanese were continually coming down through the slot, bringing troops off to Villa, dropping them here, and then using smaller barges to bring them across the strait here to Barbord Harbor in this whole area, and then using that to reinforce their forces. So there was this continual flow of Japanese troops and ships coming down to Kalamangora. At the same time, we're trying to come in this area.
Mike, you said that the Japanese were there before us. How long had they been in there before we got there?
Well, they've been in the Solomon Islands, I'd probably say, let's see, 1940. The big push through this whole area occurred right after 1940, 41. And again, you don't need a tremendous amount of time to create pillboxes, reinforcing things. But everything you read here, I mean, the units we had trying to move through jungle got separated, got isolated, attacked from the rear, packed to the front by the Japanese. In cases, ran out of both water and food. You couldn't fly in and drop parachute stuff because you couldn't figure out where they were. It was brutal. And the key was cutting off the resupply by the Japanese coming into this area. Hence, that led to the battles here, Battle of Kula Gulf and Battle of Kalamangara. Both the head Navy guy was an Rear Admiral Ainsworth. Let me just talk about the battle. Well, let's go. The Battle of Kula Gulf was again a perfect case where our ships came nicely lined up, destroyers, cruisers, and we only had about 2 cruisers at that time. Helena, I'm trying to remember the other one. Yeah, okay, we did have 3. And lo and behold, the same thing, as the Japanese came down with their group, bunch of torpedoes out. The Helena caught it right off the bat. The other cruisers caught it, not to sink them. And while we're struggling around with that, they went ahead and were able to land 1,300 troops on Kolombangora. The Battle of Kolombangora was again another effort to try and prevent the Japanese from reinforcing New Georgia by bringing troops into Kolombangora and Villa. What we kind of had here was a Japanese grouping of 1 light cruiser, 5 destroyers, 4 destroyer transports with 1,200 troops. Here's Kolombangora. They're coming down on the north side, right straight on down. Here's our forces coming up in this direction. And it's pretty substantial if you look at it. We got 5 destroyers up front, 3 cruisers, 5 destroyers in the back. Gwin, in this case, was at the tail end. We approached here. The SG radar picked up the Japanese coming down, so we knew they were coming. We figured they didn't know we were there. The only problem was, way back here, the Japanese knew we were going, because they had this other kind of system which could detect our own radar signals and actually plot the basic direction and stuff we were going. So they knew we were coming. Well, Ainsworth wasn't, you got to give him credit. He was going to at least employ destroyers and allow them to fire their torpedoes for a change. So the big plan was he was going to come in here, but you had to get close enough so your SG radar would allow you to do your, control your firing. That meant you wanted to get in with about 10,000 yards. By then, the Japanese had kind of figured out they could sneak in to about that distance and be all right. And so again, we kind of came down here. What he just said the plan was, which wasn't really bad, is we're going to bear off here. Destroyers, this is the first grouping of destroyers. Fire torpedoes up there, and they did that. And then kind of come around. But about that time, they suddenly realized, whoops, we got a lot of torpedoes coming our way. So you basically turned around, so you're kind of keep showing the smallest portion of your, your footprint toward the torpedoes. Most of them missed, except the Leander, a New Zealand cruiser, had kind of problems with control and took kind of a wide turn, and lo and behold, boom, got clobbered by a major, one of the big torpedoes, maybe 2 of them. Didn't sink it right off the bat. So Ainsworth split off 2 of the destroyers that kind of stick with Leander, came around, and at that point in time, saw on their radar that at this point, the Jinsu, or let's see, I'm looking at the cruiser, Jujinsu was the Japanese light cruiser, were in advance of everything. Well, all the Mark 37 detectors and all that stuff, everyone focused on the Jujinsu. All the firing from the cruiser, 2,000 rounds went after the Jujinsu. Took care of that real fast. But in the process, the rest of the destroyers just started moving back. The troop transport split off because all the confusion's going here. They just kind of quietly moved off to the side, load their stuff. Well, by now you would think, if you see a fleeing enemy going this way, maybe you don't want to pursue them. Well, that's what Ainsworth did. He said, okay, let's go after him. Sent a bunch of destroyers after them, couldn't find it, but he took the cruisers and the last couple of our destroyers with him. So they got charging up there, following the Japanese destroyers. Well, if you notice that they're going up there, and I don't know if they lost track of them at all, and suddenly see that they're turning around, kind of coming back a little bit, maybe that's the time to declare victory and call off. Well, the Japanese destroyers were reloading their torpedoes. And lo and behold, they came around. Once we saw here, Ainsworth was trying to reposition the cruisers so he could take them under fire with their guns. Just about the time you start that turn, once again, you're within a spread of torpedoes. And lo and behold, every one of the cruisers now, take a major hit. And unfortunately, the one poor destroyer who was following their direction and everything was the Gwin. And they took it. And lo and behold, I found another short video which describes
After escorting
that.
reinforcements to Rendola, USS Gwin sped to the new Georgia Sound, known as the Slot, on July 7, 1943, to rescue survivors from the cruiser Helena. Joining a cruiser-destroyer task force, Gwin prepared to intercept a Japanese reinforcement convoy, the Tokyo Express. This led to the Battle of Kolombangara in the early hours of July 13th. In this engagement, American gunfire and torpedoes quickly sank the Japanese light cruiser Jinsu. However, 4 Japanese destroyers lay in wait, launching 31 Long Lance torpedoes during a crucial turn by the Allied fleet. The cruisers Honolulu and St. Louis, along with the Gwin, turned directly into their path. Both cruisers sustained significant damage but survived, but Gwin suffered a fatal hit amidship in her engine room, triggering a devastating explosion. Despite valiant damage control efforts, Gwin was beyond saving. Tragically, 61 men were lost. Did you know?
Was your dad still on the Gwin?
Oh yeah, he was commander. He'd taken over command from John Higgins shortly after the Gwin got out to the Solomon Islands. So he was commander of it during that first naval battle, our second naval battle of Solomon Islands, and from then on.
So he went in the water.
Well, fortunately, I'm trying to think, I don't know I can't remember if it was the Maury, but one of the other destroyers that wasn't hit kind of stuck around, and actually they initially tried to tow the Gwin back to at least Tulagi. But by early morning, it was clear it was still going down. So the Maury, I think it was, picked everyone up and kind of brought them back. And so that kind of clarified the last, item in my collection there of understanding what did he get the Silver Star for. And it wasn't just one action. And when you read it, this, involved the whole efforts they did with New Georgia, then Rendova Island. They raced up the next day just before going to Kolombangara to get some of the Helena survivors, and also the USS Strong, which had been sunk in the Kula Gulf as well. So they kind of came back with that, and then finally with Kolombangara. And this was just, both were kind of, this comment here I took out of a book about destroyers, which actually was talking about the Gwin, where one of the crewmen had said she was a great ship. One of her crew said afterwards, but we knew she'd be living on borrowed time. I guess all of us lived on that kind in the Solomons. And so that's kind of the end. So, thank you. Okay.
Did your dad get another ship after this?
Well, Dad came back and was put in charge of the commissioning of the USS Twiggs, which was being built. That was a Fletcher-class destroyer. So I think what they do is you bring back experienced commanders and stuff to supervise the final construction and then the commissioning and then the checkout. And at that point, he turned it over to another commander. Sadly, the Twiggs, came out to Pacific, participated in Iwo Jima, and was sunk by a Japanese kamikaze off of Okinawa. with essentially the loss of everybody. So fortunately, that wasn't Dad's follow-on. After the war, you had many experienced, senior commanders and stuff who wanted to really go to sea, but, the younger upcoming crowd gets the warships. He volunteered to be the captain for a tanker, I think just so he could get back to sea for a bit, the Netches, and that was kind of in the Mediterranean stuff. But beyond that, he taught destroyer tactics, kind of coming back probably all right. Had an assignment with 1st Naval District in Boston, and that's when we lived in Rockport, Massachusetts, lovely little town. And that's where he retired to once he got out of the Navy.
Where was he when the war ended?
Let me think. Probably Norfolk area. Sometime after that he did have an assignment in Korea as part of the UN Secretariat, trying to deal with the North Koreans and stuff. And that was that funny write-up I had here.
How many years total did he serve in the Navy?
28.
20 years.
Yep. And stuff. So.
His rank?
Well, when he was last there, head of the MSTS in Europe, he was a rear admiral.
Rear admiral.
Yeah. So.
Was the Gwin involved in any shore bombardment?
Yes, very much in the New Guinea. Well, actually, during Guadalcanal too. You bring troops out, and the big thing you're doing is you're providing anti-aircraft defense for the logistic, ships that are unloading everybody. They chase submarines. You did about anything, but you had frequent air attacks. Now, before the Gwin came back to Mare Island, the only effective thing they had at all was their 5-inch guns to go after aircraft. But you had the variable, whatever the fuse is, I think, by the proximity fuse, which kind of helped. But they were given credit for shooting down, I think, at least 4 off of Guadalcanal and about 4 or 5 off of Rendova Island while they were there and stuff. But it was a constant, and again, I'm not claiming anything horrendous, this was the most marvelous thing. The Gwin was just one of hundreds of destroyers, probably at least 50, and you could see you lost at least 11, or maybe it was 14, during the period simply from August to February of 42 to 43. And then we lost certainly a bunch more as we went up the slot. By the time, what was interesting is, again, as long as we had cruisers, they had to be part of the action. And anyone who's a commander of a cruiser, it's the guns you got to have. And for us to use the Mark 37, the fire direction system, you had to get relatively close to be accurate, which kind of precluded the effective use of torpedoes. It was not until the Battle of Vela Gulf that we finally had a pure engagement that was all destroyers. And it was marvelous. Lieutenant Commander Mossberger, who had it, there was 6 destroyers. He kind of just spread them out in like a V. The Japanese came down the middle. They fired off all their torpedoes, didn't fire their guns at all. Once the torpedoes hit, boom, they knew exactly where the Japanese were and finished them off. And it was the most studied kind of effective use of that. Of course, after that, well, we have plenty of cruisers back. We've been building them like crazy. So now you're back to combination cruiser, destroyer kind of operations.
Was that
Did the
sometime?
Navy ever figure out the torpedoes?
Well, interesting enough, I think all the way to 43 plus, we knew something was going, and we knew that they seemed to be able to reach way the heck out there. But I don't think almost till the end of the war. Although, what I read is after the Battle of Cape Esperance, we actually had recovered a Type 90 torpedo, which actually just had run ashore and didn't explode. And they shipped it off to, the intel people to check it out and everything. But none of whatever they learned ever came back to the forces with that. So I think we were surprised. Yeah, John, you're
Your last line there about the guys thinking they were living on borrowed time. Gwynn was part of a 4-ship division that came out with the Hornet. First the Meredith was sunk, then the Monson at Guadalcanal,
Yeah.
and Gwynn. Grayson made it through the war, but I mean, it was like, yeah, they were all just getting ground down. The other part, the long-range torpedo, the Type 93 torpedo did have a fault. If you hit the ship it was on, that oxygen could blow the ship up, it could wreck it. And Japanese commanders got used to the idea that if they were in trouble, they just pushed those things over the side if they wanted to live.
What was interesting too is by the time we got into Leyte Gulf, the Philippines, we had lots of Fletcher destroyers out there. But with many of them, they took off the torpedoes and used that space to put in more 40 millimeter anti-aircraft guns because the kamikaze attacks were becoming so severe with there. Yeah. So anyway, but thank you very much for joining us today. Come take a look if you want.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is a rear admiral equivalent to like a brigadier general?
Yes. A captain would be equivalent to a colonel with that.